Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to a video about Aggregate Supply. It's like the only video for Area Study 2 that I haven't pre-recorded in like 2020. So I figured I should make it so there's no gaps in the playlist on the YouTube, as old people would say. It's relatively early in the morning. Eleanor is here hanging out, helping out. So that could be a little chaotic. There may be a few pauses in between, but I needed to test my gear because it's parent-teacher interview day today, so I needed to make sure it's working. So may as well do it in a productive way. So I'm going to be talking about aggregate supply today. Hopefully this is following on from you listening to aggregate demand. Aggregate supply just being the total value of all production in the economy over a period of time. We're going to look at it, the things that affect it, etc. So, aggregate supply is the total annual quantity of all finished goods and services produced by every business in the Australian economy. I like to simplify that to the total value of production, or the total real value of production in an economy over a period of time. So the total real value of all goods and services produced in the Australian economy over a period of time is aggregate supply. But the real key thing there is to have the total annual quantity of all finished goods and services. The reason why it's finished is because it has to be the final goods and services, because if it included all the resources, etc., that aren't finished, it would be double counting because their value would be counted there, and then it would also be counted when it is a finished good and service or service later on. So aggregate supply, the total real value of all goods and services produced by every business in Australia over a period of time. So how it affects economic activity. A country's productive capacity all depends on a number of aggregate supply side factors, which we'll look at. There are about 8 which are listed in the VCAR study design, if I'm to get my hands in the right spot, so 8 of them. And they're the ones that you can be specifically asked about on an exam and technically a SAC. Your teacher may teach you about more of them, but there are only the ones that are listed in the study design that you can be specifically asked about. Your textbooks will have numerous, but we'll get into later on. There's only really 2 things that affect it. And if you can use common sense to match up any aggregate supply side factor with one of those 2 things, you will be correct all of the time. So these are the main determinants of a nation's long-term productive capacity or potential level of gross domestic product. And this affects the volume and or efficiency of resources. So the 2 things that affect are productive capacity, which is how much we can produce over a period of time, is the quantity of resources and the efficiency to which we use those resources. So that determines our productive capacity. And then at productive capacity, so if you remember from units 1 and 2, or if you did it in area study 1, if you look at that production possibility frontier where you've got that curve, anywhere along that curve is working at our productive capacity. Economic activity can only increase if there are favorable aggregate supply side factors present. So these can include things like the discovery of more minerals or resources. Makes sense, if you have more resources, you can produce more. Technological breakthroughs, so when we have new technology that can produce at a more efficient or more productive rate, that's going to be great. Lower production costs, so if wages decrease, if business taxes decrease, if interest rates decrease, that's going to be favorable for aggregate supply because we can produce more at a lower cost or the same cost. And improved worker productivity, this tends to be my favorite one. If you improve worker productivity, usually through education and training, that means you're going to get more output per unit of input, and there's really no downside to that. So any of these can increase a nation's productive capacity and therefore lead to greater economic activity, providing that aggregate demand is adequate. So obviously you could have favorable aggregate supply side conditions, but if there's not enough aggregate demand, producers aren't going to expand and produce more, because that would be dumb, because they would create more products and no one would buy them, and therefore they would make a loss, or there would be a significant amount of waste. So then we've got less favorable aggregate supply side conditions which slow economic activity. So these can be things like natural disasters. Obviously that destroys our natural resources. If you think about the bushfires in 2020, it meant that our tourism industry really struggled. It meant that agricultural industry struggled, and therefore that reduced our productive capacity. If there's decreased worker productivity, less output per unit of input, that's obviously going to be bad. Industrial strikes, workers aren't working, therefore less production. And high production costs, so whether it be imports being used as factors of production, whether it be wages, whether it be taxes, high production costs means that businesses aren't going to want to produce as much, or they are going to increase prices, which is going to lower aggregate demand. So all of these reduce a business's capability to supply goods and services and therefore lower aggregate supply. So how the government can change aggregate supply. So there's a whole lot of things. There's a whole topic related to it in Unit 4, Area Study 2, Aggregate Supply Side Policies. Get hyped. But through the use of various budgetary policies, so things like taxation, subsidies, incentives like research and development incentives, the government can alter the level of aggregate supply and attempt to keep it as a sustainable rate of growth in the long term. So in Australia, we have really relied on the import and export of resources over the long term, so mainly exporting things like iron ore to China. The mining boom lines up with that, and we have a finite amount of these resources left, and so we can't rely on it forever. So the government's really trying to incentivize businesses to work in areas that will increase our productive capacity in new areas of speciality. So things like Australia's education sector, like our higher education universities, are seen as some of the best in the world. Therefore, by funding them further and making them as good as possible, we can kind of increase our aggregate supply through that area. And also trying to be innovative in new areas. Like there's a 45% tax discount for businesses who conduct research and development. This then tries to get businesses to maximize their production, and that's going to lead or find ways that they can get more output per unit of input, which is going to maximize their production. And so that's a way that we're trying to be more innovative and increase aggregate supply through the government incentivizing businesses. So aggregate supply and its supply side determinants. In the short to medium term, aggregate demand is often a critical determinant of how much firms produce. Obviously, businesses are only really going to produce enough to meet aggregate demand, and therefore, if aggregate demand is low, they won't increase their production. So in the short to medium term, they're just going to produce how much to meet the demand. But in the longer term, it really depends on business conditions that reflect the supply side factors. So my key tip for aggregate supply side factors, which I don't see anywhere else, and I think it's crazy that it isn't anywhere else, all aggregate supply side factors impact one of two things. They either impact the cost of production for the businesses or the efficiency in production for a business. So if you go back to Area Study 1, I had this exact same tip for supply. It's the same. So if it impacts cost of production or efficiency favorably, it will increase aggregate supply favorably. If it's unfavorable, it will decrease aggregate supply favorably. If you need to know this with aggregate demand, aggregate supply side diagrams, there's a separate video for that, which will be in the same playlist. So check that out if that's going to be important to you. Second last thing, so some of the factors that may shift aggregate supply, so things like the quantity of available resources and how efficiently they're used, pretty clear there. If you have more resources, you can produce more. If you use your resources more efficiently, you can produce more. Business bankruptcy rates, if businesses are shutting down, going to be less production, less aggregate supply. Real unit labor costs, so how much your workers are costing you per hour or per product that they're producing. Obviously, that's going to make a pretty clear effect on production. Government aggregate supply side policies, so taxation, subsidies, incentives, all of those kind of things, microeconomic reforms, which you don't need to know about yet. Then 5 that are far more important and come up far more often, interest rates. So interest rates for businesses impact either the cost of expanding and investing or their cost of production via the amount they have to pay back on existing loans. Productivity, your output per unit of input. The exchange rate. The exchange rate is really important for aggregate supply because it works a little bit differently to how it works in any other topic. A appreciated or a strong high exchange rate can be favorable for aggregate supply. As you've probably seen in Australia, a lot of products you buy have a label on them that say made from local and imported ingredients. We don't have a big variety of resources in Australia, and therefore we import a lot of our inputs in production from overseas. If the exchange rate is high, it can lower the cost of production for businesses as they import a lot of their inputs and therefore be favorable for aggregate supply. Not great for aggregate demand because a high exchange rate means that exports aren't going to be looking very good. But for aggregate supply, a high exchange rate can be favorable. A low exchange rate then means that inputs are more expensive, and that can lead to aggregate supply being worse off overall. Labor force participation rate, if more people are participating in the labor force, we're going to have a higher productive capacity, can produce more. And the prices of materials used, obviously cost of production, pretty clear there, goes up, bad for aggregate supply, goes down, good for aggregate supply. And that's it for aggregate supply. So just what you need to know is what aggregate supply is and the things that affect it or how they affect it. So my key tip to really hammer it down again, you really just need to remember, rather than remembering 8 different things, remember 2 things. Does it affect the cost of production for a business, or does it affect their overall productivity or efficiency? No matter what situation you get, it will relate to one of those 2 things, and then you can talk about if that is going to be favorable or unfavorable for aggregate supply. So that's it for this part of the topic. This is the first economic activity part, all summed up. From here, you'll be going on to various government macroeconomic goals, the domestic macroeconomic goals for this area of study. Depending on your school, the order you do them may be different. My school is going to do economic growth first because I feel it marries up with aggregate demand, aggregate supply really well. More traditionally, if schools just follow the study design verbatim, fancy word, well done me. But if they just follow that verbatim, they are going to probably go into inflation next. I don't really have great videos for those at the moment. I have videos from when I was like recording into some iPhone headphones, so they're not great at the moment. So I plan to re-record those when I have time. So if you are moving on to those, hopefully it's not yet. Other than that, thank you to anyone who has joined the Discord recently and is helping people out through there. It is amazing to see. Make sure you subscribe to this page because it looks good for me, so that I can do smart businessy things. But if you have any questions at all, leave a comment below, send me an email, join the Discord, ask other students. They're really helpful, they're really nice. But other than that, I hope you have a wonderful day and you don't go crazy from parent-teacher interviews like I may. Have a good day. See you later. Bye.